The scorching Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on Sam Morrison's weathered face as he guided his cattle through the rocky terrain near the Dragoon Mountains. It was the summer of 1886, and tensions between settlers and Apache warriors had reached a boiling point. Most cowboys traveled in groups of 6 or more, heavily armed and constantly watching the horizon for signs of trouble. But Sam was different from most men. At 32 years old, Sam had spent nearly half his life working cattle drives across the American Southwest. His calloused hands told stories of rope burns and hard labor, while his steady blue eyes reflected a quiet confidence that came from years of facing danger head-on. What set Sam apart from other cowboys wasn't his skill with a lasso or his ability to read the weather. It was his unwavering belief that every man, regardless of his background, deserved a chance at redemption. The morning started like any other. Sam had been hired by the Patterson Ranch to move a small herd of 40 head of cattle from their winter grazing grounds to fresh pasture near Tombstone. It should have been a simple 2-day journey, but nothing in Apache territory was ever simple. The recent escape of Geronimo and his band of warriors had put every ranch and settlement on high alert. Stories of attacks and raids filled the local newspapers, painting all Apache people as savage enemies of civilization. As Sam crested a small hill, he spotted something that made his blood run cold. Smoke was rising from the valley below, and not the thin white smoke of a campfire. This was the thick black smoke that meant trouble. He spurred his horse forward, leaving the cattle to graze while he investigated. The sight that greeted him in the valley would haunt his memories forever. A small wagon train, probably a family trying to reach California, lay scattered across the desert floor. 2 wagons had been overturned and set ablaze. Personal belongings were strewn everywhere. Clothes, pots and pans, children's toys, and books with pages fluttering in the hot wind like wounded birds. Sam dismounted and walked carefully through the scene, his hand resting on his pistol. 3 bodies lay near the first wagon, a man, woman, and teenage boy. They had been killed quickly, probably caught by surprise while making their morning camp. The attack couldn't have happened more than an hour ago, judging by the heat still radiating from the burning wood. As he examined the scene more closely, Sam noticed something odd. Most Apache raids he'd heard about involved taking horses, weapons, and supplies. But here, the horses were gone, while valuable items like silver candlesticks and jewelry lay untouched in the dirt. It seemed less like a planned raid and more like an act of desperation. A sound from behind the second wagon made Sam freeze. It was barely audible over the crackling flames, but it sounded like someone trying to suppress a cough. Moving slowly, Sam circled around to investigate, drawing his Colt .45 as he went. What he found behind the wagon challenged everything he thought he knew about Apache warriors. A young Native American man, probably in his early 20s, sat propped against a wooden water barrel. Blood soaked through his buckskin shirt from at least 2 bullet wounds, one in his shoulder and another in his side. His long black hair was matted with sweat and dirt, and his breathing came in short, painful gasps. But it was the man's eyes that struck Sam the most. They weren't filled with the wild hatred or savage fury that newspaper stories had led him to expect. Instead, they held a deep sadness and something that looked remarkably like shame. In his lap lay an old Springfield rifle, but his hands were empty and raised slightly, as if in surrender. For a long moment, the 2 men stared at each other across a cultural divide that seemed as wide as the Grand Canyon. Sam kept his pistol trained on the wounded warrior while trying to decide what to do. Every instinct told him to either shoot or ride away as fast as possible. This man was clearly Apache, and Apache meant danger to every white settler in the territory. But something else nagged at Sam's conscience. The wounded man made no move to reach for his weapon. In fact, he seemed to be trying to communicate something with his eyes, not defiance or threats, but what almost looked like a plea for understanding. "You speak English?" Sam asked, keeping his distance but not pulling the trigger. The Apache warrior nodded slowly, then spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Little bit. Learned. From missionary. When boy." "You did this?" Sam gestured toward the destroyed wagon train with his free hand. The wounded man's face contorted with what appeared to be genuine anguish. Had to. They shot first. Thought we, stealing horses. We only wanted water. Sam studied the man's face carefully. In his years on the frontier, he developed a good sense for when someone was lying. This Apache seemed to be telling the truth, painful as it obviously was for him to admit. We? Sam asked. Where are the others? Gone. Left me because wounded. Cannot ride. This revelation hit Sam like a physical blow. Apache warriors were known for their fierce loyalty to one another. If they had abandoned this man, he must be considered beyond hope of survival. In their culture, being left behind was often considered worse than death itself. Sam found himself facing the kind of moral dilemma that frontier life presented all too often. By all accounts, he should either kill this wounded Apache or leave him to die in the desert. It would be the safe thing to do, the expected thing to do. But something in the young warrior's eyes reminded Sam of his younger brother, who had died of fever back in Missouri before Sam headed west. What's your name? Sam asked, surprising himself with the question. I'm called Nalish. Means the one who works. Well, now, Nish, I'm Sam Morrison, and I've got a problem. Sam holstered his pistol but kept his hand near it. I should kill you or leave you here to die. That's what most folks would do. Nalish nodded, understanding. You're right. I am enemy of your people now. Maybe. Or maybe you're just a man who made some bad choices when he was scared and desperate. Sam knelt down but stayed out of arm's reach. How bad are you hurt? Bad enough. We'll die. Before sun sets again. Sam examined the wounds from a distance. The shoulder injury looked painful but not fatal. The side wound was more serious. It was bleeding steadily, and probably indicated damage to internal organs. Without proper medical care, Nalish was probably right about his chances of survival. Those people in the wagons, you said they shot first? Nalish closed his eyes for a moment before answering. We are what you call renegades now. Left reservation to find Geronimo. We're hungry, thirsty, saw wagons making camp, thought maybe trade for food, water, but it went wrong. White man. Gray ball turning, saw us coming. Grabbed rifle, started shooting. We shot back. Cannot take back what done now. Sam believed him. It fit with what he'd observed at the scene. The Apache had probably approached the wagon train hoping to trade or beg for supplies, but the settlers had panicked and opened fire. In the confusion and fear that followed, people had died on both sides. Why didn't you take their supplies? Their horses. Horses ran when shooting started, and I could not take from children's family. Have children of my own. Somewhere. This answer convinced Sam more than anything else that he was dealing with a man, not a monster. Despite being painted as savage raiders by every newspaper in the territory, this Apache warrior had been unable to loot from a family that reminded him of his own. The sun was climbing higher, and Sam knew he needed to make a decision soon. His cattle were unguarded, and every minute he spent here increased his own danger. But looking at Nalish, struggling to stay conscious, Sam felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a clear sense of what was right, regardless of what was smart or safe. I'm going to help you, he said finally. Nolly's eyes widened in genuine surprise. Why? I am Apache. You are Cowboy. We are enemies. Maybe we don't have to be. Sam began examining the wounds more closely. Maybe there's been enough killing for one day. As he worked to stop the bleeding with strips torn from his own shirt, Sam couldn't help but wonder if he was making the biggest mistake of his life. Helping an Apache warrior, especially one involved in killing white settlers, was the kind of act that could get a man lynched by his own neighbors. But something deep in his gut told him it was the right thing to do. Nalish watched silently as Sam bandaged his wounds with surprisingly gentle hands. You are strange, Cowboy, Sam Morrison. Yeah, well, My mama always said I was too trusting for my own good. Sam managed a grim smile. Let's hope she was wrong. As he worked, Sam began to form a plan. It was dangerous and probably foolish, but it was the only way he could think of to save this young Apache's life without completely destroying his own. The nearest doctor was in Tombstone, still a day's ride away, but Sam knew of an old line shack about 6 miles north that might provide shelter and supplies. "Can you ride?" he asked. Nalnish tested his strength by trying to sit up straighter. The effort made him gasp with pain, but he managed it. "Think so? If not far. Good, because we're going to get you somewhere safe where those wounds can heal properly." And then Sam looked into those dark eyes that held so much pain and uncertainty. "And then we'll figure out what comes next, one step at a time." As he helped Nalnish to his feet, Sam Morrison made a choice that would change both their lives forever. He was about to place his faith in a hunted Apache warrior, despite every logical reason not to. Whether this made him heroic or naive remained to be seen, but there was no turning back now. The desert wind picked up, scattering the ashes from the burned wagons across the barren landscape. Behind them lay the evidence of how quickly trust could turn to violence in this harsh land. Ahead lay an uncertain journey that would test every principle Sam Morrison had ever believed in. As they slowly made their way toward his horse, Sam couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into a future that would demand more courage than he knew he possessed. But sometimes, he reflected, a man had to choose between being safe and being right. Today, he had chosen to be right. The story of Sam Morrison and Nalnish was just beginning, and neither man knew where it would lead. All they knew was that in a land torn by hatred and violence, they had found something rare and precious, the possibility of understanding between enemies. Whether that understanding would be enough to keep them both alive was a question only time could answer. Getting Nalnish onto Sam's horse proved more challenging than either man had anticipated. Every movement sent waves of agony through the Apache warrior's wounded side, and twice he nearly fainted from the effort. Sam had to practically lift him into the saddle, supporting most of his weight while trying to avoid aggravating the bullet wounds. "Hold on tight," Sam instructed as he climbed up behind Nalnish. "It's going to be a rough ride." The journey to the old line shack took nearly 4 hours instead of the usual 2. Sam had to stop frequently to let Nalnish rest and to check that his makeshift bandages weren't bleeding through. Each pause meant more risk of being discovered by other cowboys, cavalry patrols, or worse, other Apache warriors who might not appreciate finding their abandoned comrade in the company of a white man. During one of these rest stops, Nalnish surprised Sam with a question that revealed just how much he understood about the danger they both faced. "Sam Morrison," he said weakly, "why you do this? Your people, they find out you help Apache, they kill you too." Sam had been asking himself the same question since they'd left the wagon train site. "I guess because I believe every man deserves a chance to prove he's more than the worst thing he's ever done." Nalnish was quiet for a long moment, processing this answer. "Even Apache? Especially Apache. From what I've seen, your people have had more bad things done to them than they've done to others." This statement caught Nalnish off guard. Most white men he'd encountered viewed Apache people as inherently savage, incapable of reason or morality. To hear this cowboy acknowledge that his people might have legitimate grievances was something entirely new. "You know history?" Nalnish asked. "What done to Apache?" Sam's expression darkened. "Some of it. Enough to know that your people have been lied to, cheated, and killed for wanting to live free on the land your ancestors called home for hundreds of years." As they resumed their slow progress toward the lined shack, Nalnish began to share his own story. Speaking in halting English mixed with occasional Apache words, he painted a picture of a life torn apart by forces beyond his control. His name, Nalnish, had been given to him as a child because of his willingness to work hard and learn new skills. He had been born during the time when many Apache bands were trying to live peacefully on the reservations established by the U.S. government. His father had been one of the leaders who signed treaties, believing that cooperation with the white authorities was the best way to protect their people. Father thought, If we show we can live like white man, maybe they leave us in peace, Nalnish explained as they rode. Built house like white man, learned to farm. I learned English from missionary teacher, but peace had proved elusive. Corrupt officials had sold reservation supplies meant for the Apache people, leaving them hungry and desperate. When young Apache men had left the reservation to hunt for food, cavalry soldiers had hunted them down like criminals. Families had been torn apart when children were taken away to distant schools where they were forbidden to speak their own language or practice their customs. Father died of broken heart, Nalish continued. Saw his people becoming, beggars in own land. Mother died of sickness that winter when government food never came. Sam felt a growing anger in his chest as he listened to this account. He'd heard rumors of corruption and mismanagement at the reservations, but hearing it from someone who had lived through it made the injustice real and personal. So you left the reservation to join Geronimo? Not at first. Tried to make it work like Father wanted, but soldiers came one day, said we must move to different reservation, smaller place, worse land said was for our protection. But we know it was lie. Now Lenish's voice grew bitter as he described the final straw that had driven him to become a renegade. A young Apache woman named Itzel, whom he had hoped to marry, had been assaulted by a drunken soldier. When her brothers had tried to seek justice through proper channels, they had been arrested and imprisoned. The woman herself had been blamed for tempting the soldier and shunned by some of her own people who feared retaliation. That night, I could not stay anymore. Took horse, left everything, went to find Geronimo. Better to die fighting than live as prisoner. Sam absorbed this story in silence, understanding now why this young man had made such a desperate choice. It wasn't savagery or inherent violence that had driven Nalnish to join the Apache resistance. It was injustice and a system that seemed designed to crush his people's spirit. By the time they reached the old line shack, the sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon. The small wooden structure had been built years earlier by cattlemen as a shelter for cowboys working far from the main ranch. It was isolated enough to provide safety, but close enough to water and basic supplies to keep them alive while Nalnish recovered. Sam helped his wounded companion down from the horse and into the shack. The interior was basic but clean. A single room with 2 wooden bunks, a small stone fireplace, and shelves stocked with canned goods and basic medical supplies. Previous occupants had left behind coffee, beans, and even a bottle of whiskey that would serve as disinfectant for Nalnish's wounds. This will do, Sam said, settling Nalnish onto one of the bunks. Now let me take a proper look at those bullet wounds. What Sam saw when he removed the blood-soaked bandages was worse than he'd hoped, but better than he'd feared. The shoulder wound was clean. The bullet had passed through muscle and skin without hitting bone or major blood vessels. With proper care, it would heal without permanent damage. The side wound was more serious. The bullet had lodged near Nalish's ribs, and Sam could feel it just under the skin. Removing it would be dangerous and painful, but leaving it in place might cause infection or internal bleeding.
I'm not a doctor, Sam warned as he prepared his makeshift surgical tools.
But I think I can get that bullet out if you can stand the pain. Nalnish gripped the wooden bed frame with both hands. Do it. Better to die trying than die doing nothing. The operation took nearly an hour. Using his heated knife blade sterilized with whiskey, Sam carefully probed for the bullet while Nalnish bit down on a leather strap to keep from crying out. The Apache warrior's stoic endurance impressed Sam. Most white men would have passed out from the pain, but Nalnish remained conscious and alert throughout the procedure. When Sam finally extracted the flattened piece of lead, both men were exhausted and covered in sweat. But the worst was over. Sam cleaned the wound thoroughly with whiskey, packed it with clean cloth strips, and bound it tightly to prevent further bleeding. You'll live, he announced with satisfaction, but you'll need to rest for at least a week before you can travel far. As night fell over the desert, the 2 men shared a simple meal of beans and coffee while getting to know each other as individuals rather than representatives of opposing sides in a larger conflict. Sam talked about his childhood in Missouri, his decision to come west after his brother's death, and his dreams of someday owning his own ranch. Nalish, in turn, shared stories of his Apache childhood, learning to track animals and read the signs of weather in the desert sky. listening to elders tell ancient stories around evening fires and the deep spiritual connection his people felt to the land itself. White man sees land, thinks how to use it, Nalnish observed. Apache sees land, thinks how to be part of it. Maybe that's where we went wrong, Sam replied thoughtfully, trying to own something instead of trying to belong to it. As they prepared for sleep, both men were acutely aware of how strange their situation had become. Just hours earlier, they had been on opposite sides of a violent conflict that showed no signs of ending. Now they were sharing food, shelter, and conversation like old friends. But the morning would bring new challenges. Sam's cattle were still out there unguarded, and his absence would soon be noticed by other cowboys in the area. Nalnish was still a wanted man, whose presence could bring deadly consequences for anyone helping him. They had bought themselves some time, but they hadn't solved the fundamental problem of how to navigate a world that demanded they be enemies. During the night, Sam was awakened by the sound of Nalnish talking in his sleep. The Apache warrior was speaking in his native language, but his tone suggested he was reliving some traumatic memory. Perhaps the wagon train incident, or maybe something from his past that had driven him to such desperate choices. Sam lay awake listening and thinking about the complexity of the situation they both faced. Tomorrow, he would have to decide whether to continue helping this man who had already cost him precious time and potentially his reputation. Every logical consideration told him to leave Nalnish with some supplies and ride away to save himself. But logic had never been Sam Morrison's strongest quality. His mother had always said he was guided more by his heart than his head. And his heart was telling him that this Apache warrior represented something more than just another enemy to be defeated or avoided. Nalnish represented the possibility that understanding could bridge even the deepest cultural divides. He was living proof that Apache people were not the savage monsters portrayed in newspaper stories, but complex human beings capable of conscience, regret, and growth. As dawn approached, Sam made his decision. He would continue to help Nalnish not because it was safe or smart, but because it was right. In a world torn apart by hatred and misunderstanding, someone had to take the first step towards something better. Whether this choice would ultimately prove him to be a hero or a fool remained to be seen. But Sam Morrison had chosen his path, and he would see it through to whatever end awaited them both. The test of his character had begun, and only time would reveal whether his faith in humanity was justified or dangerously misplaced. Outside, the desert wind whispered through the sagebrush, carrying with it the promise of challenges yet to come. Inside the line shack, two unlikely allies slept fitfully, each wondering what the next day would bring to their fragile alliance. The third morning at the line shack brought unexpected visitors and a test that would determine whether Sam Morrison's faith had been justified or catastrophically misplaced. He was checking Nalnish's wounds, pleased to see that infection hadn't set in, when his horse whinnied nervously outside. Both men froze, recognizing the warning sign that other riders were approaching. "Stay down and stay quiet," Sam whispered, helping Nalnish lie flat on the bunk before moving to the small window. What he saw made his blood run cold. 6 riders were approaching the shack, and Sam recognized their leader immediately, Sheriff Jim Hawkins from Tombstone, accompanied by a cavalry lieutenant and 4 armed civilians. They had the look of men on a manhunt, and their presence here was no coincidence. "Sam Morrison!" Sheriff Hawkins called out when they were still 50 yards away. "We know you're in there. Come out with your hands visible." Sam's mind raced through his options. Running was impossible. They were outnumbered, and Nalnish couldn't travel fast enough to escape pursuit. Fighting would be suicide. That left only one choice: face the consequences of his decision and try to protect Nalnish through whatever was about to happen. "I'm coming out," Sam called back, then turned to Nalnish. "Whatever happens, let me do the talking. Don't admit to anything they can't already prove." Nalnish struggled to sit up despite his wounds. "No, Sam Morrison, I will not let you die for helping me. We'll tell them truth. The truth will get us both killed. Trust me one more time." Sam stepped outside with his hands raised, squinting in the bright sunlight. Sheriff Hawkins was a fair man by frontier standards, but he was also thorough and not easily fooled. The cavalry lieutenant looked young and eager, probably hoping to make his reputation by capturing Apache renegades. "Morning, Sheriff," Sam said calmly. "What brings you out this way?" "You know damn well what brings me here, Sam. Found your cattle wandering loose 2 days ago. Tracked you here from that burned wagon train." Hawkins dismounted but kept his hand on his pistol. "Question is, what exactly have you been doing since then?" Sam had rehearsed this conversation in his mind, but facing it in reality was different. One wrong word could doom them both. "Found the wagon train after the attack. Terrible thing. Been tracking the Apache who did it." "Tracking them?" The lieutenant spoke for the first time, his voice skeptical. "Alone? On foot? For 3 days?" "Sometimes tracking means waiting them out instead of chasing them down." Sam met the young officer's gaze steadily. "Apache know this country better than we do. Sometimes patience works better than speed." Sheriff Hawkins studied Sam's face carefully. The two men had known each other for several years, and the sheriff could usually tell when someone was lying. But Sam's story, while unusual, wasn't impossible for someone with his tracking skills. "Mind if we take a look inside the shack?" Hawkins asked. "Just to make sure you haven't found more than tracks." This was the moment Sam had been dreading. "Nothing to see but supplies and a place to sleep, but you're welcome to look." As the group approached the shack, Sam's heart pounded so hard he was sure everyone could hear it. If Nawlish had passed out or was too weak to play his part in the deception Sam had planned, everything would fall apart in the next few minutes. The sheriff pushed open the door and stepped inside, followed by the lieutenant. Sam held his breath, waiting for shouts of discovery and the inevitable gunfire that would follow. Instead, he heard Sheriff Hawkins curse in surprise. "Jesus, Sam, why didn't you tell us you were hurt?" Sam rushed inside to see what had happened. Nawlish lay on the bunk exactly as Sam had positioned him, but now he was covered by one of Sam's spare shirts and wearing Sam's hat pulled low over his face. In the dim light of the shack and with his lighter skin tone, he could easily be mistaken for a wounded white man. "Didn't want to worry anyone," Sam said, thinking fast. "Took a bullet in the shoulder and sighed when I got too close to those Apache. Been nursing my wounds and trying to figure out how to get back to town." The lieutenant stepped closer to examine the wounded Sam. "How many were there? Which direction did they go?" Nawlish, playing his part perfectly despite the pain it must have caused him, mumbled something incoherent and turned his face further away from the light. His breathing was labored enough to convince anyone that he was seriously injured. "Hard to say," Sam answered. "Maybe 6 or 8. They headed north toward the mountains after the fight, probably trying to catch up with Geronimo's main band." Sheriff Hawkins examined the blood-stained bandages and medical supplies scattered around the shack. Everything supported Sam's story of a wounded cowboy recovering from a violent encounter with Apache raiders. "We should get you back to town," the sheriff said. "Doc Patterson can take proper care of those wounds." This was exactly what Sam had hoped to avoid. Moving Nawlish in broad daylight surrounded by armed men would make discovery almost certain, but refusing medical attention would arouse suspicion. "Appreciate the offer, Sheriff, but I'm not ready to travel yet. Lost a lot of blood. Another day or 2 of rest and I'll be strong enough to make the journey." The young lieutenant was still studying the scene carefully. Something about the situation seemed to bother him, though he couldn't put his finger on what it was. "You said there were 6 or 8 Apache," he said slowly, "but I count at least 10 different horse tracks around this shack. Some of them look fresh, like they were made yesterday or even this morning." Sam's blood turned to ice. In his concern for Nawlish's wounds, he hadn't thought to cover the tracks that would inevitably accumulate around their hiding place. The lieutenant was more observant than he'd given him credit for. "Could be from previous visitors," Sam suggested weakly. "This shack gets used by lots of different cowboys." But the lieutenant was already kneeling outside the door, studying the ground more carefully. "These tracks tell a different story. Unshod ponies mixed with shod horses, Apache horses mixed with white men's horses, and some of them are definitely fresh." Sheriff Hawkins joined the lieutenant outside, and Sam knew their time was running out. Once they started examining the evidence more carefully, the truth would become obvious. He had to do something to protect Nawlish. even if it meant sacrificing himself. "Sheriff," Sam called out, "there's something else you should know." But before he could continue, the sound of approaching horses interrupted him. This time, the riders weren't cavalry or lawmen. They were Apache warriors, and they were coming fast. "Everyone inside!" the sheriff shouted, recognizing the danger immediately. "Defensive positions!" The next few minutes were chaos. 7 Apache warriors on painted ponies swept down from the hills surrounding the lined shack, whooping and firing rifles as they came. Sheriff Hawkins and his men took cover behind their horses and returned fire, while Sam found himself caught between 2 groups of armed men who considered each other mortal enemies. But something strange happened as the battle developed. Instead of trying to overrun the shack, the Apache warriors seemed to be focused on something specific. They were calling out in their own language, and their leader, a fierce-looking man with eagle feathers in his hair, kept pointing toward the shack itself. "They want something inside," the lieutenant observed during a brief lull in the firing. Nalnish, despite his wounds, had struggled to the window and was listening to the Apache voices outside. Suddenly, his face went pale with recognition. "Sam," he whispered urgently, "that is my brother, Taza. He looks for me." The pieces fell into place in Sam's mind. These weren't random raiders. They were the same band that had abandoned Nalnish at the wagon train site. They had come back for him, either to rescue him or to ensure he couldn't be captured alive and forced to reveal information about their whereabouts. "Can you talk to them?" Sam asked. "Make them understand the situation?" Nalnish nodded, though the effort clearly cost him. Moving painfully to the door, he called out in Apache to his brother. The response was immediate. All firing stopped as the warriors recognized his voice. What followed was a rapid conversation in Apache between Nalnish and his brother Taza. Sam couldn't understand the words, but he could read the emotions: surprise, relief, anger, and confusion. The sheriff and his men kept their weapons ready but held their fire, recognizing that something important was happening. Finally, Nalnish turned back to Sam with tears in his eyes. "My brother," he says, "they came back for me because they learned the truth about the wagon train. The White family, they were not innocent travelers." "What do you mean?" "They were gun runners, selling weapons to Apache enemies to use against our people. My brother found their hidden camp, saw the rifles and ammunition they carried to arm our enemies." This revelation hit Sam like a physical blow. The family he'd mourned as innocent victims had actually been profiting from the very conflict that was tearing the territory apart. They had been selling weapons that would be used to kill Apache families, making money from both sides of a tragic war. "The attack," Nalnish continued, "it was not raid for food or supplies, was justice for crimes against our people. But I did not know this. Thought we were killing innocent family. Has been eating my heart like poison." Sheriff Hawkins had moved close enough to overhear this conversation. "Are you saying those folks in the wagon train were arms dealers?" "My brother swears it is true. Says they have proof at the hidden camp. Rifles marked with army numbers, ammunition meant for cavalry units." The implications of this information were staggering. If true, it meant that the innocent family had been guilty of serious federal crimes. Selling military weapons to civilians was illegal, and selling them in Apache territory during active hostilities could be considered treason. But it also meant that Nalnish and his band had been acting to protect their people, rather than simply raiding for profit. While their methods had been violent, their motives had been defensive rather than aggressive. The standoff continued for another hour while Sheriff Hawkins, the Apache warriors, and Sam tried to work out a solution that wouldn't end in more bloodshed. The situation was unprecedented. Law enforcement officers, Apache renegades, and a cowboy who had risked everything to help a wounded enemy were all trapped together by circumstances none of them had anticipated. Finally, it was Nalnish who proposed a solution. Despite his wounds and weakness, he struggled to his feet and walked slowly outside, where both groups could see him. "I will go with lawmen," he announced in English loud enough for everyone to hear. "We'll stand trial for killing at wagon train, but first, we show you proof of what dead white men were doing. You see for yourself if they were innocent or criminals." Taza protested angrily in Apache, but Nalnish silenced him with a gesture. "Brother, this cowboy Sam Morrison saved my life when you left me to die. He risked everything for enemy. Now I risk everything to prove truth is only way to stop the killing. What happened next would be talked about in saloons and newspaper offices for years to come. The two groups formed an uneasy truce and traveled together to the hidden camp Taza had discovered. There, exactly as promised, they found enough evidence to prove that the wagon train family had indeed been illegal arms dealers. Military rifles, ammunition, and correspondence with known criminals created a paper trail that reached all the way back to corrupt officials in Tucson and beyond. The family had been part of a larger network that was profiting from conflict while ordinary people on both sides suffered and died. Sheriff Hawkins examined the evidence carefully before making his decision. "This changes things," he announced. "These weapons dealers were criminals, and stopping them was legitimate law enforcement, even if the methods were unconventional." The young lieutenant started to protest, but Hawkins silenced him with a look. "Son, I've been keeping the peace in this territory for 15 years. Sometimes justice doesn't come from a courtroom." In the end, a deal was struck that satisfied no one completely but offered something to everyone. Nalish would surrender voluntarily and stand trial, but the evidence of the arms dealing would be presented as justification for his actions. Sam would testify about what he had witnessed, including Nalnish's remorse and his attempts to minimize harm to innocent people. Taza and his warriors would be allowed to return to the reservation without pursuit, on condition that they cease all raids against legitimate settlers. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it offered a path forward that didn't require more killing. As they prepared to ride back to Tombstone, Sam found himself walking beside Nalnish, who despite his wounds had insisted on riding his own horse rather than being transported as a prisoner. "Do you think we did the right thing?" Sam asked quietly. Nalish considered this question for a long moment before answering. "Right thing is not always clear thing, but we tried to choose path of honor instead of path of hate. Maybe that is enough." At the trial 3 weeks later, Sam Morrison testified about everything he had witnessed: the wagon train attack, his decision to help a wounded enemy, and the discovery that the victims had been criminals rather than innocents. His testimony, combined with the physical evidence of the arms-dealing operation, created reasonable doubt about whether Nalnish's actions had been motivated by savage cruelty or legitimate justice. The jury deliberated for 2 days before reaching a verdict that surprised everyone. Nalish was found guilty of manslaughter rather than murder, acknowledging that while his actions had resulted in death, the circumstances had been more complex than simple criminal violence. He was sentenced to 5 years in territorial prison, with the possibility of early release for good behavior. But the real verdict had already been delivered in the court of public opinion. Newspaper accounts of the trial, particularly Sam Morrison's testimony about the Apache warrior's character and remorse, began to change how some people viewed the conflict between settlers and Native Americans. It wasn't a complete transformation. Prejudice and hatred ran too deep for that. But it was a beginning, a crack in the wall of misunderstanding that had cost so many lives on both sides. Sam visited Nalnishan prison regularly over the next 3 years, bringing books and news from the outside world. The Apache warrior used his time in confinement to further improve his English and to write letters to government officials advocating for better treatment of his people on the reservations. When Nalnish was finally released, he faced a choice that would define the rest of his life. He could return to the reservation and try to rebuild his existence within the system that had failed his people, or he could disappear into the desert and continue fighting a war that was already lost. Instead, he chose a third path that no one had expected. He became an advocate and translator, working with reform-minded officials to improve conditions on the reservations and to prevent the kind of misunderstandings that had led to so much violence. Sam Morrison, meanwhile, had used his fame from the trial to establish his own ranch near Tombstone. He hired both white and Apache workers, creating one of the few integrated operations in the territory. His success proved that cooperation between the two cultures was not only possible, but profitable. Years later, when both men were older and the Apache wars had finally ended, they would often sit on Sam's porch in the evening and talk about those 3 days in the line shack that had changed both their lives. "Do you ever regret it?" Sam would ask sometimes. Giving up your freedom to prove a point about justice? Nalnish would smile and shake his head. Freedom is not just being able to ride wherever you want. Freedom is being able to live with honor, even when honor costs you everything else. Sam Morrison had placed his faith in a hunted Apache warrior, and that faith had been rewarded in ways he never could have imagined. He had saved one man's life and, in doing so, had helped begin the slow process of healing between two peoples who had been taught to see each other as enemies. Whether this made him heroic or naive was a question that would be debated by historians for generations to come. But for Sam and Nalnish, the answer was simple. They had chosen to see each other as human beings rather than symbols of conflict, and that choice had made all the difference. In the end, the desert wind that had carried the smoke from that burned wagon train would continue to blow across Arizona for centuries to come, but it would also carry the memory of two men who had proved that trust could triumph over prejudice, that honor could overcome hatred, and that sometimes the most heroic act was simply treating an enemy as a fellow human being worthy of compassion and respect.